Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of the Introduction to Design Systems. For this video, we are going to be looking more into a more advanced version of a type scale. If you haven't watched the previous video already, I highly recommend it. It goes a little bit into the basics of type scale. The one we're going to make today, I personally really enjoy. I kind of pulled it from what they have in the Apple design system. I really enjoy it. I think it's very well laid out, and it makes developer handoffs much simpler in my opinion. So we're going to hop over into Figma, and you'll see I've already pulled in an example of what we're going to be making today. You also notice we have last time's type scale here, something very simplistic, very quick. It doesn't have a lot of styling to it. We can definitely do a lot more with it. This is, however, the layout that I prefer, and this is something we're going to be going towards. The reason I enjoy this type scale, you'll notice it gives us the basic information, type scale. For this one, I did a mobile and a desktop version, so I listed desktop. I listed the typeface I was using and the project I was using it for. You don't have to lay it out that way. That's just what I did. Designer's preference, I guess. But the reason I like it, if you come into our individual fonts, and I should not have used this many typefaces. I try to stick to no more than 6 different font styles in my designs. This was a little while ago. Definitely needs to be iterated upon. But for argument's sake, let's just say this was a good example. If you come into each of these individual fonts, you see we have our pixel size. I also converted that to rem. I don't know if you guys remember, in a previous video I talked a little bit, very briefly, about how developers like to, instead of using pixels for font sizes, they will use what's called rem or m. They're very similar units of measure in font. Basically, the reason they use that is because it is more responsive. And it's a very simple conversion from pixels to rem. It's 16, right? So if I have, you notice here I have 3 rem, that is equal to 48 pixels. Basically all that's saying is 48 divided by 16 gives me 3. That's my rem. And that's how they can make it a little bit more responsive. So I go in, I list the pixel size, and that's more for a designer standpoint. I list the rem size. I also list the hex code. This is not a pure black font that I'm using. It's close, but it's not purely black. So I throw in the hex code there as well, so the developers know what it is exactly I'm using. And this hex code should be one that's pulled out of your color styles, your color palette already. I also listed the character spacing, which can be found, if you come in closely, can be found over in your text panel. And then I also listed the line spacing as well. So I went through and I listed these things in particular because this is, I feel like, a very good starting point for a developer. And I'm a very firm believer that the sooner you can establish clean assets for handoff and establish clear communication with your developers, the quicker your project's going to go, the more smoothly it's going to go, and the better end result you're going to have. So I went through and I did that with all of my fonts. List their size, their hex code, their character spacing, their line spacing, etc. And we're going to build one of these on our own here using our typeface that we selected in the previous video. If you remember, we selected San Francisco Pro Display. So we're going to be using that. Just wanted to look at a quick example before we did, and we're going to be emulating something similar to what we have here. Talk too much, guys. I'm getting thirsty. Okay, so let's start. We're just going to throw up, and we'll just do it right down here. We'll throw up another artboard, somewhat similar in size. Doesn't need to be as big because we're not going to use as many typefaces and different fonts, but something similar. I guess we only use one typeface, but not as many font choices. So I'm going to do something very similar. I said we want, and I know I've messed with this a little bit, so I'm going to reset that back to auto. I am going to say type scale. Don't really need to worry about desktop for this instance. We're not really designing anything in particular. SF Pro Display. And you know what, we'll just leave it at that. We'll just do type scale, San Francisco Pro Display. Let's make this a little bigger. We want to use one of our fonts from, or our sizes from our type scale, maybe 30, 24. Let's see how 24 looks. Now let's go up to 30. Why not? And we'll just kind of align this where we want it. I'm a base 8 fan. You'll learn that about me very quickly. Okay, we've got our header. Now it's time to dive into the actual fonts. And I'm going to actually bring this down here for reference so we don't have to keep scrolling up. Now you'll notice I did this kind of in reverse order from the original type scale that we did. I went from largest font down to our smallest font. The reason I did it this way, this is very much set up for a developer. You'll notice I didn't use headers like title, subtitle, heading, subheading. I started to once we got into body blog, things like that. But I wanted this to be easy for my developers. You can definitely do multiple versions of this, one that is for designers, one that's for developers. But developers, when they're working in CSS and styling, they're looking at, and I guess not so much CSS solely, but also in HTML, they're looking at your font sizes as H1, H2, H3, I believe all the way down through H6. So that's kind of why I set it up this way. So a designer can hand it to a developer. They can go into their CSS and say all of the H2 components that are in this design are going to be, 42 pixels or 2.625 rem, this color with these attributes, and it will be throughout the design. To make their lives a little simpler and to make sure what they're actually building stays consistent with what it is we have designed. So let's hop in and let's start with our biggest font size we've got here. We've got 30. So I'm going to type H1 and we're going to bold this just so it stands out a little bit more. You can play around with it, see exactly how you want to style it, but that's what I'm going to do for this instance. So I've got H1, very simple. I want to make sure when I'm doing this, the H1 actually represents what it would look like. If you remember, we came over here, each of these text examples is the same size as what we say it is. And that's so the developers can very easily say, well, it looks something like this. Let's type in the numbers. Whatever pops up on the screen should be very similar to this. It gives them an idea of what they're coding. So we have 30. We already got that set at 30. I just set it to auto for now, which automatically displays the line height as 30 as well. And we're not going to worry about character spacing right now. I'm not too worried about that. That's a little more picky, but we want to get the big ones, size, color, line height, etc. So we'll skip over character spacing for now. You can include that if it's something that you want to include, if it's something that your developer team wishes to have in there. So let's just go through the same order that we have here. Ooh, almost knocked over my water there, guys. That would have been bad. So we'll add our, and this isn't necessary, but just for consistency's sake, I like to have that pretty little line under our H1 element. Maybe I'll make it, half a pixel thick. I don't know. It's not important. Underneath it, we're going to throw in some description. So I'm going to say that H1, maybe I want my H1 to just be, maybe I want it to be bold. It's a big title, it's standing out. Maybe I want it to be really bold. So first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to write SF Pro Display bold. And obviously this needs to be smaller. The only thing I really worry about being the exact size is the example we have up here. But I'm going to take this down to, I don't know, is 16 one that we included in our type scale? 16, that'll work. And that itself does not need to be bold. It can be bold. Maybe we'll go with more of a medium on that. And then below that, I'm just going to copy this down here. I want to include the specifics of my text. So if you remember, if we come up here, we have a line height of 30, a pixel size of 30 as well. So let's just go down the list. Let's go through the same order that we did before. We have 30 pixels, which and I should have organized this better. You'll notice on some of these I put rem next to pixels. Some of them I did not do very well at doing that. I want to have the size consistent, right? Keep it in a little group. So I'm going to do the math right now. Again, we're dividing by 16, so I'm just going to take 30 divided by 16. That gives us 1.875 rem. Now we have a unit that they can use that's more responsive in the design. Next, we want to get our hex code. What color are we choosing for our text? Well, if we go back to our color palette, I think just for simplicity's sake, I'm going to go with something very dark. I don't want it to be quite as gray though, so maybe I'm going to go with this blue tint here. So I'm actually going to copy my hex code here. And obviously, if this were a real project, I would put a lot more thought into what I'm doing for my color, but it's not as important right now. We're just going through, this is an example, right? So we've got our hex code, we've got our size, we need our line spacing, which I believe we said was also 30. So we'll just say line 30. Now, again, oops, maybe I don't want this to be complete medium. Maybe I'll just do regular for that. It's not as important. You guys can play around with that a little bit. You're designers. Use your intuition and some of the background knowledge you have and the research that you've done to know. Set up some hierarchy here. But I like that. That's not a bad start. So what I'm going to do is I am going to pause this video real quick. I'm going to go through. Actually, before we do that, there's one thing I haven't done yet. If you remember, I put in this text, but I did not change it from pure black. This needs to be an example of what we are using for our type scale, right? So I am going to change the color of this text. I'm just going to input that hex code that we brought in earlier. Not a huge change, but you'll notice there is a slightest tint of blue to that. Okay, now we're ready to move forward. I'm going to put you guys on pause so you don't have to watch me walk through every single one of these. As I'm doing this, feel free to go back and look at kind of how we've set this up. It'd be awesome if you guys built one of these with me. And then when I finish this up, we'll come back and we'll look at what everything looks like put together and get it prepped for handoff. So I will see you guys in just 1 second. Okay, guys, so I've gone through, I finished this up. I made sure all of our examples are the right hex code. They have the right color to them. And I've done the calculations for rem. The line height's the same through all of these in this instance. But this is somewhat what you should get, something that is simplistic, something you could print it out on a card if you want and just hand it to your developer and they would know what they need to do, right? Now, please don't feel like you have to use 5 different font sizes. Don't feel like you have to use 6. Don't feel like you can't. I always go by, less is more in this instance, but it depends on your situation. Use your judgment, use your research. What your app needs will determine how many different fonts you need to have. But we want something like this. Hopefully you guys were able to recreate something like this on your own. If not, again, I highly recommend you give it a try. This is what I have found to be, in my experience, the most, I don't want to say the most effective way of a developer handoff, but this is something that developers have responded to very well for me. And again, I pulled this right from Apple's design system, so obviously it's got some credibility there. But yeah, that's one more step down, right? We're starting to collect these assets. We've got a color palette, color styles. We've got our type scale. We're gonna, in the next video, we're gonna hop into inserting our text into text styles in Figma as well, so we'll be ready to go there. We don't have a ton left to do before we start to put all these pieces together. In the next video, like I said, we'll work on text styles and then we'll move into components and so on. So I will see you guys in the next video.